Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. This is Launching, Learning, and Leaning on AI, lessons from my first semester teaching. My name is Brianna Atkinson. I work at Spartanburg Community College in South Carolina. I'm the online systems manager and, as of recently, a new English adjunct. Okay, so a few months ago, it was about 11 p.m. at night, and I got a call from my aunt. I was half asleep, already in bed, very deeply in my rest, and I rolled over and answered the phone. My aunt was in a complete panic. She was writing an article for a medical journal with two of her peers, and although the article was due in just a couple of hours, her peer had only just sent in her portion of the work. The problem was that portion was completely off topic, and my aunt had no idea how to integrate that third of the writing into the 2/3 that she already had. After a few minutes of her completely melting down over the phone, I told her, just put it into ChatGPT. She probably panicked even more, saying that there was no way she could do that, that there was no time for that it was unethical. She just kept going on, and I said, again, just put it into ChatGPT. After a while, she calmed down a little bit and she said, okay, well, I can try. And I helped talk her through some prompts. Eventually, she says, Brianna, this is perfect. This is exactly what I needed. And I said, okay, great. And I tried to hang up the phone and go back to sleep. About 10 minutes later, she calls me and she did it again. And actually, it's not that good. But at least now I have a place to start. I have an idea of the path that I can take. And she was a little more confident that she'd be able to include everyone's portions in a way that resulted in a submission that was on topic and an article she could be proud of. I tell you the story to make 2 points about using AI. First, to drive home the fact that I have never been satisfied with the output AI gives me, no matter how many times I've altered my prompts, how many iterations I've gone through. And I think a lot of other people end up finding that they feel the same. And second, to show that AI is being widely used already in ways that we might not expect. On screen, I have a prompt I put into ChatGPT. It says, what are some ways AI being used in industry? Give me simple examples, maybe 5 or so, in a variety of industries in a format I can easily display in a presentation. It came back with a couple of different examples. Healthcare, AI is helping diagnose you. Hiring, AI is helping decide if you get an interview or not. Policing, AI is predicting where and who might be committing crimes. Banking, AI is controlling your loan approval. And education, AI is tracking student behavior. Along with the ethical concerns and the usage concerns, I think it's important to start off by highlighting the environmental concerns as well. So just training an AI chatbot can use as much electricity as over 1,000 US households use in 1 year. Again, just training the AI chatbot emits 626,000 pounds of dioxide, nearly 5 times the lifetime emissions of an average car. Once you've trained the chatbot, you start using it, right? Well, a single ChatGPT query uses 10 times more electricity than a regular Google search. ChatGPT's daily queries cost as much electricity as 33,000 US households consume in an entire year. So there's implications here. The infrastructure is not set up to support this kind of electricity requirements. And that results in costs for people. By 2027, AI will use as much electricity as the entire country of the Netherlands. And by 2027, AI will require more than 4 times as much water as Denmark consumes annually. In case you didn't know, AI also uses water in order to cool down its systems. And to remain functional, AI servers need to be on at full capacity 24 hours a day. these figures are only expected to continue to grow. Here we have a graph of data power demands. You can see it's relatively flat up until the introduction of AI, at which point it starts to increase exponentially, and that trend is expected to continue, that trend of exponential increase into the future. This is a very short video that I found of people in Georgia in the United States who live very close to a new data center for AI. It's not going to play in this, but I do have my work cited on the next slide, as well as a QR code that you could scan to get the live links. That'll tell you a little bit about what it's like to live next to a data facility and the environmental impacts of that. I'll also include these details in my presentation in case you're not able to scan this QR code. But you watched this presentation to hear about the lessons I learned from my first semester. So let's start with rolling the clock back. I started graduate school in August of 2020. And to be honest, I was really skeptical and honestly a little bit nervous about AI when it first came on scene. So I didn't actually try it until April of 2024. I was going on vacation to a place I didn't know that much about, coincidentally with the same on for my earlier study. So I used AI to help think of places to go and things to do on that trip. And it went fairly well. So in July of 2024, I used AI as a student for the first time in my classes. I know. But mostly I was using it for image creation, which was entirely unrelated to what I was being assessed on. On one specific assignment, the assignment was to create an entire syllabus and a variety of specific assignments with very specific considerations. I used AI to come up with ideas for one rubric for one of those assignments, which I still ended up editing substantially. For any time that I used AI as a student, if I submitted it, I told my teacher how it had been used, and none of my instructors ever had an issue with this. Finally, I graduated in December of 2024 and started fantasizing about all the books and TV shows that I would be catching up on, only for in January of 2025, just 2 days before the semester began, I was asked to teach a class. Well, I was ecstatic, of course, but I was also very, very panicked. I was very nervous, had no idea what to expect. I had no lessons planned, and as you'll see, I ended up relying on AI to help me fill those gaps. Now, on screen is an example of what happened when I used AI as a student. To set the context, I had been assigned a reading with some associated questions. I was taking notes as I read, and afterwards I thought to myself, well, I already did the work. I already have these notes. Maybe I can just ask AI to clean these notes up into a coherent paragraph. That's the exact phrasing that I used. I won't read the exact response because I don't expect everyone to know the details of the Norman conquest of England, but I will let you know that the paragraph itself looks very professional and coherent, but actually implies something that's totally incorrect, is totally historically inaccurate. And no amount of my prompting made the AI ever fix it to be accurate. So keep in mind that accuracy is always an issue when it comes to AI usage. But getting started with my actual class. So one of the first things I used AI for was to help me come up with icebreakers. I was nervous. I was sure my students were nervous. And I asked AI how I could randomize question orders in a fun way. I ended up coming up with a way to choose question orders based off of student birth month, and it ended up being a really fun and unique idea that my students were surprisingly enthusiastic about. Another thing I really struggled with as a first-time English instructor was sample writing. Students always wanted samples of what I was looking for in their work, and I didn't have any past student examples to give them. I was able to go through my old USBs and my old hard drives and find my own old work and put that into AI, ask AI to tweak it to be at a different grade level, to be about a different topic with the same general format, and was able to get a variety of samples that way. That was a huge help. And also with personalizing content. So I have a couple of examples of that on the next slides. Here is where I asked it to help me come up with alternative essay ideas. So I gave 1 or 2 essay ideas that I had enjoyed when I was a student or that other instructors at my institution were using, and asked it to come up with different essay topics. I was able to personalize this by saying things like, I want it to be for English 101 students. I want it to be something interested to high school students. I wanted it to be something they had to do their own research to find out more about. Okay, gathering content. This was also really, really big help. So I used it for things like gathering content in terms of peer review. I asked it to help me come up with a form that my students could use. After a couple of iterations, I came up with this table that I submitted to students. So it took me about 7 prompts in order to get what is on screen. And even now it's substantially different because I had different focuses, I had different priorities. I came up with this unscrambled essay activity. So there was paragraphs and students had to order the paragraphs. AI helped me come up with a variety of different essays to use in this. Interested in research as more than just something they had to do to write a paper in class. So I asked AI to help me come up with examples of that would be appealing to students. So I was able to put in information about my individual students and their majors. I was able to ask it for examples of research that was new and interesting or had been done by students their age. So that this was all things that would have taken a lot more time for me to track down on my own. Instead, AI suggested it to me, and I was able to verify on my own that this was real examples of research and find real examples online that matched some of those things AI prompted me on. Admin work and adaptive work. This is another place that AI was extremely helpful. What do I mean by this? So pivoting online. During one of my very first weeks teaching, we had a snow day and class was canceled. I was very upset to hear this because I had been up all night figuring out what I was going to do in class, and those activities weren't going to work for online. I asked AI how I could translate some of those activities into online activities, and I asked AI to help me come up with questions for a Kahoot game that we could do during our synchronous during our synchronous class live. Brainstorming. So there's a lot of situations you come across as an instructor that you're not prepared to handle, and you might have to come up with a response very quickly. For example, I had one particular student who was an English second language learner and had different needs compared to the rest of the class. I was able to ask AI for a couple of different methods to work with the student without interrupting the rest of my class. And I did not use any of the particular suggestions given to me by AI, but it was very helpful to get my own brain working about creative solutions to this issue. Class emails were a big one. Being able to send out emails with reminders and make sure that my tone was the correct tone that I was looking for, that my email was professional without being pedantic, such things like that. And also personalized emails. It's never easy to figure out how to example. I was able to use AI to put in the email that I had already written and ask it for suggestions and changing things up to be a little more empathetic when I felt more empathy was needed, etc. scheduling meetings was a big one. Throughout the semester, I was asked by my supervisor to organize the research symposium, which is normally very difficult because students will send in their time availabilities and scheduling it can be very difficult. I was like, sure, no problem. And I knew she was really surprised by that. But that's because I had already learned that AI can be very helpful for scheduling meetings. You can put in the number of people, the number of time slots, the availabilities provided, and the AI will generate a schedule for you. Student feedback. One of the surprising things that I found was that I could use AI to help me make sense of what my students had submitted. I had one particular student who submitted a paper, and one of those paragraphs was very confusing. I wasn't quite sure what he was getting at. I asked AI to break down the logic in the paragraph, at which point I was able to discover that the student was struggling because he didn't have a firm yes or no answer. His answer was more of a yes, but. And he himself was not aware that that was acceptable. So when I met with this student one-on-one, I was able to say, hey, I think this is what I have gathered from your paragraph. And when he said, yes, that's exactly what I meant, I was able to say, it's totally fine for you to have a yes, but answer. You don't have to pick a side, yes or no, but you do have to be clear in your opinion and substantiate it. And he was able to come up with a much better paragraph on his second go around. And then for check-in surveys, again, I was a brand new teacher. I was very concerned and nervous. So at one point in the middle of the semester, I asked AI to help me generate a survey that I could ask my students to take and let me know how I was doing. And AI was able to help me pinpoint some of the areas of concern that I wanted to ask about. And of course, flops. Of course, there were some. So one of the biggest issues that I had with AI is that no matter what, it's very formulaic. Especially as an English instructor, I was of the opinion that I prefer my students to turn in writing that is more personal rather than follows a specific format. And AI did the exact opposite of what I recommended. So I had to be careful when I was asking AI to generate that sample work because I had times where the work generated would directly contradict what I asked my students to do because it was too formulaic. There were errors. I found there was one particular time where I asked my students to write an annotated bibliography, and I asked AI to generate some sample annotated bibliographies, and there were errors in those. I had actually noticed the errors and tried to correct it on my own, but I guess in the process of undoing and redoing as I was editing my presentation, those errors ended up in the final submission, and I could tell that my students noticed. And also out-of-date information. When AI first came out, I believe it was up to date up to 2021. It has been updated, and I think ChatGPT is now accurate as of October 2023. But a lot of things are changing very rapidly in today's society, and you might not notice that something is out of date if you're not aware of the development. So it's always important to double check the information you've received, verify it separately from AI. Then a couple other things that I noticed happening, I call this AI blindness. So you might get into a little bit of promptception, which is where you spend so much time editing your prompt and reiterating and changing things up that you might start to forget your initial point. So this happened to me, for example, when I asked it to help me generate some new ideas for one of my essays. I had a specific format that I wanted my students to follow in terms of you need an introduction, you need a refutation, you need a conclusion, you need X amount of sources, etc. And by the time I had spent so much time generating new prompts, the actual specifications of what I wanted my students to turn in had changed, and I hadn't noticed because I had spent so much time iterating my prompts. So my students were very confused and asked me, hey, am I supposed to do this? I don't see it on the list of requirements. And I had to very quickly pivot and say, oh, yes, what I expect is, and so forth in the middle of class. And then I call it Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? I don't know that that's the most accurate way to explain what I'm talking about, but I thought that was a fun reference. But essentially, what I'm getting at is that sometimes you start to forget what human writing sounds like, and you start to forget that AI does not sound that human. Um, and this again can happen when you get a little bit too deep in the prompts or when you've spent too much time working with AI content. You start to forget that what you're reading doesn't sound very natural. And it's not until you have a little bit of distance from it, in my case, when I'm actually have these examples on screen and I'm looking at it and my students are also looking at it, and both of us know this was not written by a human. But AI can't do it all yet, anyway. There were some things that I had to do on my own. First off, there were curriculum and standards. My department had its own standards, expectations. There were certain slows that I had to meet. And of course, I had my own priorities, my own things that I thought was important to emphasize in class. All this meant that I couldn't ask AI to generate entire lessons for me or even an entire series of lessons for the entire course. I was the one coming up with topics for each week and, for the most part, filling in the blanks of what I was going to be doing. I had my own priorities and preferences again. So, for example, as I mentioned, I prioritize authentic student writing over formulaic writing. I wanted to focus more on technical writing skills rather than writing for writing's sake because I work at a community college and I thought that met my students' needs better. AI wasn't going to do that for me. I had to know that that was my priority and emphasize it over and over again. And then gaps in guidance. I usually knew what I wanted to cover on my own, and I was using AI to fill in the blanks and brainstorm. But generally, I knew I was the one coming up with the actual content of the majority of my courses. I knew what I wanted to emphasize. I knew the very important things that I had to go over time and time again. And also, to be clear, it wasn't just me and AI. My department chair, my peers were also big helps as I was teaching. And then finally, teaching with AI. I knew from day one that I wanted to do an AI lesson with my students. So I focused on that from day one. From the very first lesson, I emphasized the human touch. I emphasized things like curiosity, being able to separate true from false and how that serves you in real life, presentation skills, and again, how that is useful in the workforce. Gaining actual knowledge as a tool, something that you use outside of the classroom. And so when I talked about that when I talked about that during the lesson on AI, it came across very authentic when I say things like I've never been satisfied with the AI result and that you can't rely on AI 100%. Again, if you plan to teach with AI, it's very important for you to decide on your AI policy, both for you and for your students. What will you use AI for, and what will you allow students to use AI for? What will you allow students to get away with? Because certainly they will be using it in ways you don't expect. I As for my own policy, I decided that I think of AI as a tool, but not a replacement for a human. And so I expected my students to use it as a tool as well. If I could not look at that piece of writing and think to myself, this is 100% AI generated, if I wasn't sure, I took that as an indication that they were using AI correctly or how they would use it in the actual workforce and took that into consideration. Be transparent. When you're clear on your own policies and hard lines, you can engage with an honest you can engage in an honest dialogue with the students. Don't just say what you're going to do, but why you're going to do it. And I think that openness, that back and forth, gives a lot more grace with your students in terms of when they're going to be using AI, how they're going to be using it, and how they'll remain ethical in its usage. So I did explain to my students what I used AI for in the class in some of the same slides that I've shown in this presentation as well. And then finally, consider student privacy. I have come to the decision that I'm not going to be uploading student work in its entirety to AI unless I have the explicit option to say that it's not going to be uploaded to a database. You don't have to come to the same conclusion, but I do think it's important to think about this in advance and decide what your conclusion is, what your own policy around student privacy is, and to be prepared to explain it to students if questioned. So on screen for this slide and the next couple of slides are some examples directly from my AI lesson. So I showed them on screen how I used AI in their class, the prompts that I used, asking it to come up with additional essay ideas. And so they were able to see that the prompts that this AI came with the brainstorming activity for me. There were some AI prompts. So I asked them to work together in class to come up with some prompts that they could use to help brainstorm a topic for essay 3. And we worked on these together in class, things like elaborate more on AI in today's times, tell me more about human rights issues that are happening today. I'm interested in fabric and weaving. Can you tell me some modern issues related to these topics? I'm interested in becoming a surgeon. What are some human rights issues in the surgical field? These were prompts that we brainstormed together in class. I explained to them, again, some ethical ways to use AI, things like idea generation and brainstorming, narrowing topic scope, gathering background information, understanding opposing views, and designing. And again, given that I had shown them how I had used AI in class as well, this came across much more authentic. And finally, I reminded them, AI is only as good as your prompt. Always fact check, consider privacy. Your thoughts should be your own. Don't allow AI to come to your conclusions for you. And maintain your critical thinking, reading, and writing skills. Again, these are all things that I had been emphasizing since day one in class. Things like misinformation and privacy and critical thinking skills are all things that I emphasized in class outside of today's lesson. So when we talked about AI in class, it rang true. Thank you. I hope you have a wonderful rest of Fusion. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me at atkinsonb@sccsc.edu.